All right, hi folks. Welcome to lecture 8A. So this unfortunately has to be just a recorded lecture rather than in class this week. But hopefully we'll post it online so that you'll still have the same time during class to watch it and should cover all the same things we were planning on covering. So with that, announcements as usual. Just as a reminder, your final project report and presentation are going to be due, I guess, tomorrow if you're watching this on Tuesday, Wednesday night. And that will give me time to randomly assign the peer reviews, which will then be due later in the week on Saturday, just before finals week. There is a muddiest point for this week, basically just over this lecture, and a concept check for both and mini project for both Unit 7 on neural networks and this unit, Unit 8. But like I said, we've increased the number of drops for both of those. So that basically means that the concept check and the mini project for this unit, Unit 8, is going to be optional. You also shouldn't expect really anything on the final exam covering this unit, Unit 8. But the content of this Unit 8 will give you an opportunity to do that concept check and that mini project if you so choose. But just keep in mind that they're due really soon, the end of this week. So not a lot of time left for those. And that's basically it, other than the muddiest point. Like I said, there's still a muddiest point this week, so there's a drop policy on those, but it's always good to get those. Those are very helpful for me, so go ahead and turn that in as well. And then as a reminder, there is no lecture Thursday. I have to be out of town. Which is part of the reason why I'm recording this here Tuesday, and there's not a lot of content we have left really to cover anyway. So those are the major announcements. Course evaluations should close Thursday night. There are practice resources for the final exam available in the final exam module, so take a look at those. All right, so if you have any questions about any of that, feel free to send me a note, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started on this new material, which is focused on complex systems models of communication, or sorry, of computation. So we're specifically going to focus on the effect of space on computation and then introduce you to these things called cellular automata. So I'm going to start out with some motivation for what we're doing, why we're doing all of this stuff. And I'll go into this in more detail, but basically, computation and information processing in natural systems is naturally distributed over space. There are simple local interactions, as in neurons, which we'll talk about in a little bit here in the next page here, but they give rise to complex global patterns. And those are emergent phenomena. And we'll talk about that here in a second, what we mean by emergent phenomena. And so we need tools to better understand that if we ever plan to harness that type of that type of computation. So to give you an example of the importance of trying to understand the role of space, then we're going to talk about these interacting particle systems and specifically the so-called voter model and how dimensionality affects the sort of collective behavior of the voter model. And then we're going to close up with an introduction to cellular automata, specifically elementary cellular automata, ECAs, which are these one-dimensional cellular automata, and show you the NetLogo tool, which gives you a way to kind of experiment with those ECAs so you can kind of get to know those rules. Okay, so that's the kind of roadmap for what we're doing. So thinking back to where we just left off with Unit 7, remember the brains are systems of small components, neurons here, that all interact purely by local phenomena. So I talked about action potentials. That's how one neuron ends up stimulating the next neuron, which might generate its own action potential, which will stimulate more neurons downstream. And we also talked about the learning rules that underlying, at least so far as what we think, underlying all of the learning in real neural networks in brains in the nervous system in the central nervous system as these local processes like spike time dependent plasticity as well as just general Hebbian learning. So these we view as local processes. There's not a global supervisor pushing down on it. There might be spatial structures, there might be uh, triggers of larger scale phenomena that create couplings, like the release of dopamine in the brain that suddenly makes the entire brain change kind of its learning dynamics. But underneath it all, learning is implemented at a local scale by a bunch of distributed interactions among simple neurons, which we can characterize as individual cells and pretty much understand how those cells work. But it's really difficult to scale up and try to say, from those neuronal properties, how do you get a brain? What are the properties of the brain? So we can know the neuron, but it's really hard to know the brain, and it's really hard to understand how you connect the two of them together. And that's because the brain is a complex, and we're emphasizing this term, complex network of interactions, which give rise to emergent phenomena. What do we mean by emergent? Emergent basically means these are phenomena that are really difficult to understand by the local mechanisms alone. So they're global phenomena at the scale of the brain, for example, in the case of the brain, that definitely are due to these neurons and all of their properties. But if you just look at a single neuron alone without the network, it's really difficult to say how do you get a brain out of that. And that's what we mean by complexity. If we think about something that's complicated, like a wristwatch, then every component is kind of clear exactly what it does. And so you could imagine from the perspective of this component, this part of the wristwatch, this screen or piece of glass or this knob on the side, you kind of know what their function is, and you can kind of picture that that function is going to stay the same at any scale that you look at of that wristwatch. For a single neuron, you don't really know what is that neuron, how is that neuron like a knob in a wristwatch or the glass on the front of your wristwatch. It's just not that easy. So that's the difference between complex and complicated, is that when the network of interactions give rise to global behavior that is somehow qualitatively different than the behaviors you'd expect if you look at each individual component alone. That's what we mean by complex and complexity. And large scale systems in human society are similarly complex and heterogeneous. And so it's very difficult to sort of project up and try to say at the level of, not at just the level of a country or a level of a city or a level of a small town, also just at the level of a household. Predicting household dynamics simply by knowing the individuals separated in a household is very difficult to do. Household family dynamics are themselves a complex system because the network really matters. Other examples from developmental biology, there's a bunch of patterning in the development of biological systems, like the stripes on a zebra. That themselves, how do you get those stripes? How do the individual cells learn when to turn black, when to turn red? I didn't say learn, sorry, they don't learn, but how do they decide when to turn black, when to turn white? Those individual cells there's not some governing agent that is telling the cells, okay, there's enough black right now, let's flip to white. That's enough white right now, let's flip back to black, and so on and so forth. Those stripes are not patterned in that way, that somehow that decision making has to happen at the collective level using these local rules. It's another complex system where the network is what makes that emergent phenomena happen. Landscape ecology happens in that as well. So we don't think of as a landscape as a living organism, like a single organism. It's just sort of a community of these organisms. And yet you still get these interesting and repeatable patterns across different types of landscape that clearly are somehow predictable from properties, but those properties don't exist at the level of the local scale. So knowing about a blade of grass doesn't quite tell you enough to be able to predict the large scale patterns you see across a grassland. So that's what we mean by this being complex systems. And so, we see a lot of this in nature. We see a lot of interesting information processing in nature that has a lot of features that we might want to mimic when we engineer artificially intelligent systems. Because complexity seems to show up so much in nature, that sort of suggests that maybe we need to understand complexity, because maybe if we ever want nature-like artificial intelligence, those themselves might need to be built on top of some complex principles. And one example of that is reservoir machines from the last unit. That was a case where we greatly simplified the design of a neural network by randomly drawing weights to create a dynamical system and used the dynamics as a type of encoder, which turned complex temporal patterns, where I should say difficult to classify temporal patterns, into spatial patterns that we had tools that we could then decode. So that dynamical system, which itself could be viewed as a complex system of interconnected weights and all that kind of randomly drawn weights in this weird recurrent neural network, we were able to turn into an asset instead of a liability, embrace the complexity, and use its global properties as a tool on which we can bolt on simple networks that we know how to build, so that the overall system of our simple design networks in this complex randomly drawn fixed encoder together give us more capability than a network that we would have built from scratch up, where we designed everything kind of with more traditional methods. So embracing complexity may lead to completely different types of designs, and those designs might be better than the designs that we could get if we didn't embrace complexity. So that's what this unit is really kind of all about, building these tools up so that we understand how we might use complexity. And in this lecture, I'm going to be focusing a lot on space. So the role of space in developing computational models to understand the role of space. And one of those tools that we have for that are so-called interacting particle systems. So this is sort of a subset from probability theory. It's a type of stochastic process that is focused on modeling the dynamics of sort of how things change when they're coupled together with sites. So these are locations on a map and how those locations relate to each other. So we're focusing on a random variable, we'll say, at a particular location, and how the distribution of that random variable depends upon the realizations of the random variables that are spaced around it in some neighborhood in some way. And so we're trying to understand, how does the shape of that neighborhood affect, in the terms of a random process evolving over time, the patterns that we see in the individual variables and the variables that are around them. So if you're familiar with cellular automata, which we're going to return to at the end of this lecture, this is a special case, or can be viewed as a special case of these interacting particle systems. All right, so that's the high level. Let's get into that example in a little bit more detail, and maybe it'll be nice to be a little more concrete here. So this is an example I like. I took from Duren and Levin. This is an older paper. So if you want to read more about this and other examples related to that, I recommend you look at that paper. And that paper is actually available. It's linked from this unit, Unit 8, on the Canvas page. So recall that in our genetic algorithms, or just generally when we talk about evolution of populations and allelic distributions and all that, we've got a major force in evolution is genetic drift. So genetic drift, right over here. And we know that genetic drift, in the examples we've seen, tends to force things towards fixation. So we are going to be thinking about these same processes, but the framing we have won't be quite as much in terms of evolution of strategies over generations, but more it's in terms of the dynamics of opinions on networks of interactions among those who could share and adopt the opinions of others. So the idea here is that now, instead of modeling the distribution of alleles over generations, then the way this model, this is the classic model, and so I'm just using the terms from that classic model. So they're referring to the distribution of voter opinions. So this isn't actually meant to necessarily model real voters, but we're using voters as just food for thought. We're saying that every voter has an opinion. I like position A, I like position B, I like position C, I like position D. And you can view that as kind of like the genotype of that voter. And we're interested into seeing across all voters, then what is the distribution of those genotypes? What is the distribution of those opinions? So that's our kind of reframing of evolution in terms of this voter opinions. And then genetic drift, well, that is a mechanism for copying opinions from others. So, and this will become clearer as we go back down through this example here, but in genetic drift, what we said is that there's these genotypes, we're not going to give them any fitness benefit. We're not saying one opinion is better than another, but we're saying that the distribution of opinions in the next generation might happen randomly. And what we mean by that is that there's might be some individuals that just happen to get, hit by a meteor or something like that. And regardless of what opinion they have, they are of the same likelihood of getting taken out by that meteor. And then their spot is going to be taken up by individuals around them. So that's going to mean that certain opinions are going to grow in representation just randomly, relative to others. And that's, an example of genetic drift. And in the case of the voter model, then they sort of model that as individuals randomly copying the opinions of those around them. And that random copy is like a random expansion, similar to that kind of meteor hitting and then others being filled into that. And then fixation. So then we're interested in whether we reach consensus. So in the evolutionary model, fixation is just one genotype ends up taking over the whole population because there's no selective pressure that's driving any other genotypes to grow. So that genotype that has the most representation tends to, in the next generation, be grow in its representation because it sort of is more resilient to drift forces than the minority ones. And then as it gets an even greater share of the population, it becomes even more relatively resilient and so on and so forth until eventually, once everyone is of the same genotype, then it doesn't matter what meteors are hitting who, because it doesn't actually change the distribution of everything. Everybody is the same. And so if we cast that into a voting framework or a voting opinion framework, then fixation is another word for unanimous consensus on one opinion. And so when we're modeling these interacting particle systems, what we're interested in are what are the conditions that lead to consensus. In engineering problems, we often in distributed algorithms are interested in so-called agreement or consensus. In other words, we have a bunch of distributed sensors. They take measurements. There's uncertainty. We want to pool those measurements in some particular way so that all of the group as a whole says, okay, we are going to agree that this is the temperature. You think the temperature is a little hotter. The temperature is a little cooler. Over time, we share our opinions and we end up coming to an agreement that the temperature in the room, based on all of our samples, is probably this single number that we all agree on. So consensus and agreement algorithms, very big in distributed computing and distributed algorithms. And this is sort of another model of how these algorithms might play out. Okay, so um, the voter model, like I said, is basically a model of evolution by only drift where fixation is consensus. Votes are distributed over a lattice of sites. And so a big difference between what we've talked about so far in population genetics and evolutionary algorithms is that in those cases they've been panmictic. There's just a mixing. Everybody can interact with everybody else. So if you have mating, crossover, and things like that, then and anyone is potentially could mate with anyone else. There's no spatial dependency. Drift does not, if a meteor hits, it could hit anybody. It doesn't, locally affect one group more than others. There's no effective space. Everybody is kind of just mixed up and floating around and constantly has access to the same areas or is likely to come in and access each other. Now we're getting rid of that assumption. And we're saying that now everybody is stuck to a particular spot in a lattice of sites. And I'm going to give a one-dimensional example below, and then we're going to extend that to 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So the voters are stuck in place and stuck in their house, and they've got houses next to them with other voters in those houses. And all they can observe are the voters next to them. So everybody has an opinion. My opinion is A, your opinion is B, somebody else is C. So there's 4 possible opinions, like there's 4 candidates or 4 positions or 4 stances. However you like to conceptualize that, there's 4 opinions, and those opinions, every house on the street, there can be a different set. We're going to be different opinions, and so one house, even house A, might or the house on the left might be A, the house next to it might be B, the house next to it might be back to A, and so on. And houses observe the opinions of those around them, and then can, at random in this model, take the opinion of those around them. Okay, so each opinion is equally valid. So we're not saying that there's an opinion that is somehow better than the other opinions. The evolution of or the change in distribution of these opinions is not driven by the value of each opinion. We're saying that all 4 of these opinions are equally valid, and it's totally random whether one grows in distribution or shrinks. So each voter updates her opinion by a random draw of the neighborhood of opinions around her. So there is a certain local set of voters that each voter can see, and from that local set of voters, in the next generation, they randomly draw their opinion from those around them. So they can't see everybody, they can only see a small neighborhood of those immediately near them. So this neighbor network, so who's connected to who, is we're going to use the word irreducible. And that just means that in the network of interactions, there is a single connected component. So that doesn't mean that every neighbor can see, or every voter can see every other voter. That's not what it means. What it means is there's a path from every voter to every other voter. So one individual can influence others through the same path given enough time. So one individual might have their opinion be copied to another, one of their neighbors, and then that neighbor might have another neighbor who's farther away from the original individual copy that opinion. And that could keep relaying over and over and over again until that opinion theoretically could reach the entire network. That's what we mean by it being irreducible, a single connected component. There are no two components. It's not like you can say what a reducible, the opposite of an irreducible network would be a network where you actually have two networks that you've just kind of called a single network, but when you look at it, you realize, well, actually, this is two separate problems, and these two groups don't interact with each other at all. So I can just handle one problem separately from the other. That's not the case here. Here we're saying that there is one single connected component. That's important. Okay. And so what might that look like? Here's a one-dimensional version of that. So we're saying here are all the houses on the street. So house, 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 house. This house has opinion A. This house also has opinion A. These houses have opinion C, and so on. So step K, this is at time now. And we know that every house has a certain set of houses that it can see. So it might be that this house can see two houses down from it, but it can't see any further than that. So that is the neighborhood that is around this house right here. And for the voter model, I'll say this formally on the next slide here, but we're going to assume that this structure of this network is what we call translation invariant. And so that means that we're going to assume that everybody can see the same distance away from them. So if we're just going to say that if this one can see these two houses and these two houses, then this one can see these two houses and these two houses. And so they have the same shape of the network, but so it doesn't vary, but they can't see each other. So they don't have the same network, but they have the same network shape. And so that's the idea, is that each one of these, so this one has a certain network, they're going to randomly draw from one of the four neighbors, in this particular case, around them, and that will update their opinion in the next generation. They're going to do that over and over and over again. And then our question is, if we then go many, many steps further down the line, so much greater than K, at time to infinity, then what will the distribution of opinions be? And specifically, what we care about is what is the equilibrium distribution under neutral selection? Do we get fixation of a single type? Is there unanimous consensus? And if there's not, what are the conditions under which there's not? And so, again, you could view this as modeling some weird version of voting, but it's a little weird for voting. But it actually is maybe a better model to think about under what conditions do we expect genetic drift to produce fixation across genotypes? And are there spatial distributions that spatial structures that actually cause neutral selection, not natural, neutral selection to maintain diversity or maintain heterogeneity in these genotypes rather than purge it like we normally might expect in our panmictic model of genetic drift. All right, that's the story there. Let's generalize it a bit. So what we're saying is that the voter model, again, this is just classic model of interaction particle systems. In the general case, what is the effect of space on consensus? So we're saying that sites are embedded in a d-dimensional lattice. So what do we mean by a d-dimensional lattice? Well, d is our dimension. It comes from one to, so you get a one-dimensional lattice, that's this right here, a two-dimensional lattice, a three-dimensional lattice. We're assuming the lattice is infinite, goes on in either direction here. And so they can move, opinions can move kind of wherever there are voters, and voters are at each one of these positions. So these are addresses on the street. So this is a single street where everybody is lined up on a line. And so you can have voters at every address on the street. Now, if we up this from dimension one, so this right here, this is the d equals 1 case. We up it from dimension 1 to dimension 2 here. This is our dimension equals 2 case. Now we've got people that can live on a grid. So now you can have a house here and a house here and a house here and a house here, a house here, a house here, and so on. So now everybody is on this grid of houses. And so it doesn't seem like it's that different, but that's our question, is that how different is it? And at what point does it get too different? What point does this spatial structure matter? So we went from everybody being on a line to now everybody is in a grid. And we can go one more step, of course, we can keep going many more steps, an infinite number of steps, but then, another case here is then 3 dimensions. So now we have everybody is in a volume. So this would be like it's almost like apartments now, where multi-story apartments. So now it's like you can have an apartment building at any particular location in the grid, but then that building has a height, and those buildings have a height. So your address is a latitude and a longitude, but it's also a floor. So I live on the 5th floor of the building at latitude X, longitude Y. And so then now we've got a volume that you can live inside. So basically this D, it is indexing, formally we call it, ZD. So there's integer coordinates all the way to infinity on both sides, infinity to negative infinity for this whole lattice here. And this is the number of dimensions in the lattice. We're interested in the question, what is the effect of space on consensus? And we're going to focus on a simpler version of that. Does dimensionality matter? And how does dimensionality matter? So if you have a way to take a bunch of voters and you can give them neighborhoods of as big as you want or as little as you want or whatever, we're not actually worried about the size of the neighborhood. We're worried about the shape of the neighborhood and how that affects how opinions kind of percolate through the resulting network, given that their gateway to get from one voter to another are through these neighborhoods. So the topology of these neighborhoods. So each site has got an opinion holder. And from there, the neighborhood structure, that's again how these opinions bubble through here. I'm just kind of building this from bottom to top here. So who does each site observe around them? That's what we mean by a neighborhood. So again, if you live here, then maybe there are these around you. That's your neighborhood. Maybe it's a neighborhood that extends in the Z dimension as well. So you pay attention to not just those directly on your floor, but also the floor above you and the floor below you. So you might have a large volumetric neighborhood where you're looking up, you're looking down, you're looking left, you're looking right. Those are all the ones you're observing to take your next opinion from. That's what we mean by the neighborhood. We're using the same neighborhood shape across all. So if I'm paying attention to my upstairs or my downstairs neighbor, my left and right, then my left neighbor is looking at their upstairs, downstairs, left and right. And so everybody's got the same shape. They've got the same perception radius, if you will, but they don't have the same neighborhood. So my neighborhood is different than my neighbor's neighborhood. I'm in my neighborhood's neighborhood. My neighbor is in my neighborhood, but there are other people in our neighborhoods that are not shared. All right, so that's our basic setup for this voter model. So how do we model opinions as they move along this space? as people change their opinions, adopt it, and so on. Well, I think the first thing we could think about doing is modeling the number of individuals with each opinion. That's kind of a an easy way to do it. I don't want to say easy. It's a natural way to think about it. You say, I've got four opinions, A, B, C, and D. I'm just going to count how many people in my population have opinion A, opinion B, opinion C, opinion D. And that count has to add up to my total number of my population, but the distribution of those counts might change. And that kind of, it's like the number of individuals with a particular allele. It makes sense. So that's all we're sort of capturing here. This is me saying, the natural numbers, I guess. So the natural numbers including zero, the whole numbers. So basically the non-negative integers. And so I'm saying that each one of these is a non-negative integer, a count, and I have four counts. And that is one way that I can model this. Okay, fine. Let's think that through. That's a Markov chain. So the number of counts now um, gives us probabilities on what counts will be one generation later. And then once we get to that generation, once you know the current generation, you got probabilities of the next generation. So it's a Markov chain. So we can do stuff in the Markov chains. But it's not a very nice Markov chain. It doesn't have ergodicity, which is this a property which it gives us a lot of different mathematical tools related to that, and the most importantly, it has many absorbing states. One of them I list here, where I'm saying once everybody has opinion A, then in the voter model, then that's the only opinion that can exist. There's nothing that introduces new diversity once it's been purged in the voter model. So once everybody's got opinion A, then it stays in this distribution forever. But that also applies to opinion B, opinion C, opinion D. So there's four absorbing states of this Markov chain, all 0, 0, 0, 0, all 0, 0, 0, 0, all 0, and 0, 0, 0, all. So that's a little ugly because when you have absorbing states, especially when you have multiple, but it's bad enough when you have one. But when we have one absorbing state, it's pretty easy. Everybody just goes to it. But when you have multiple absorbing states, then there are fewer analytical tools for us to understand the distribution across those absorbing states um, and in general just sort of what's happening going to those absorbing states. So just there's less math we can work with. It's just an uglier model. We can't really get to the question of how often do we reach consensus. We know that consensus conditions exist. We know that once you're in a consensus condition, you stay in that consensus condition forever. But we we don't know how long it takes to get to consensus, and we don't know if you might get stuck loitering around between other states that don't lead you to those consensus states. We don't know as much about the transiency, or whatever. So that's not really ideal. But we don't, and the other thing is we don't really care about which consensus state you get into. We don't care about, how often you're A versus B. What we really care about is it guaranteed that you're going to reach an absorbing state? Is it guaranteed 100% of the time that eventually, given enough time, you are going to land in a consensus state? That's what we really care about there. And so maybe there's a simpler way that we can model this that helps us better get at that. And that's where we get to the dual process for the voter model. And this is like a contact tracing of opinions. This is typically difficult for students to grasp the first time they've ever seen this. And so I'm going to try to go slowly through this. It's natural to have questions about this. Um, it's really cool once you get it, though. It's like once you realize that this is a way that you can analyze these types of systems. The idea that we're going to get, and now that a lot of us have lived through a pandemic or whatever, then contact tracing. When I used to teach this before COVID, it was a lot harder to make sense of it because people didn't really think about contact tracing all that. When I started to teach it with students who went through an epidemic or pandemic, then they were familiar. They had heard about contact tracing, and this became much more natural. And that's all we're basically doing is a contact tracing of opinions. We do that with a time reversed trajectory. We're going to turn time around and go backwards through time that traces the opinion of one individual back through the other individuals that it copied from. The from there, that's what we're doing. That's the contact tracing there. So what does that look like? Well, this is the axis, and I'm going to work this little example here. So no, I've got, in this case, I've got 6 individuals that instead of putting them on an infinite lattice, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and it still works. I'm going to put them on a toroidal lattice, a torus. I don't mean like the car, I mean like it circles around. And so individual 0 is next to individual 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but then individual 6 wraps around, and then she is next to individual 0. So that wraps, this 0 is the same as that 0. I just did it there to show that this sort of wraps around on itself. It's just a ring where we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's what I mean by it's on a torus. Okay, so we got our individual IDs here. Now look what I got here on the time axis, time. It's going backwards. This is time now, t. This is the initial time, 0. And so when I move this way, I'm actually moving backward toward the initial condition. It seems really weird. I'm hoping it'll make sense in just a second. So what I want to do is I want to say, okay, at the current time right now, I don't know what opinions each individuals have. I'm not keeping track of what opinions each individual have. I'm keeping track of where they got their opinion. So when there was I have to say, the opinion you have now, did you have that opinion in the last time step? And if not, who did you get your opinion from? That's what I'm plotting. I'm not plotting the actual opinion, I'm plotting where they got the opinion. So we're saying at time t, so I mean, this is a little silly to plot this time t, but okay, time t, what I'm saying here is that, all right, where do you get your opinion from at time t? Well, at time t, my opinion is my own, so I'm going to say that I'm going to focus on individual 6 here. So I'll put a dot here. Time t, that's where my opinion is. Okay, where did you get, what was your opinion? Who did you get your opinion from at time t minus 1? So, well, 1 step ago, well, that's the same as the opinion I have now, so that was also me. Okay, well, who did you get your opinion 2 steps ago? Well, okay, that was also me. I had the same opinion. The opinion I have now was the opinion I had 1 step ago, was the opinion I had 2 steps ago. All right, 3 steps ago, who did you get your opinion from? Oh, I got my opinion 3 steps ago from individual 5. So I'm going to connect these. So that is showing the path of, my opinion now was individual 5's opinion 3 time steps ago. And if I go further and further, I can continue to ask individual 6 where that opinion came from. So, or I mean, yeah, so let's just pretend like I kept doing it. So I'm gonna keep doing that throughout time, and eventually I get to time, make this, I'm gonna make it so that at time 5, so this is time t minus a lot. At time 5 steps, at 5 steps after the initial time, then what this is saying is that individual 6, so I'm just going to connect this with kind of I've got the technology here, so I'm going to just connect it with like a dotted line maybe, or yeah. So I've got this dotted line here that is connecting um, across time, so maybe I'll make it jagged just for style. And so at some time in the past, its trajectory was taken from individual 3. That at the time just before that was still individual 3. And then the time before that was individual, we'll say, yeah, so this is individual 3. The time before that was individual 2. And then at time, we go back up here, we'll say that maybe it was individual 5. So I'm just going to fill this out here. Just jump up to individual 6 and back down to 5. Well, I don't want to end on 6. I don't want that to confuse things. I'll just end on 4. That's fine. Okay, we'll do that. And then we'll talk this through. Okay, so what this is saying is that if I had to say, where did your opinion come from? So at the current time, it's my opinion. One time step ago, I can say that, or several time steps ago, I can say I got it from individual 5. So really, it was individual 5's opinion 3 time steps ago, and then it became my opinion. So what this is saying is that at time 0 here, then the opinion that individual 6 has now was the opinion that individual 4 had at time 0. If I did that, did I draw that straight? I think I did. Yeah. Or I'll try to draw that straight. Let me erase that and draw that straight. Okay, so sorry about the delay there. Okay, so individual 4, I think it's 2 ticks up, so it's right here. That's cleaner. Okay, so that's what we're saying, is that individual 6's opinion now is the opinion that individual 4 had at time 0. It's weird, right? But yeah, so that's it's that, individual 6, it got its opinion from 5. But where did 5 get its opinion from? That's kind of what we're saying here, is that you were saying that these individuals, like individual 4, had an opinion at time 0. Well, individual 4's opinion at time 0 apparently got copied. So the individual, we're just following where this opinion from individual 4 that here flowed through the network and ended up in individual 6. That's how individual 6. How did you get this opinion? It's like, how did you get sick? Well, I got sick because individual 5 got sick. Individual 5 got sick because individual 3 got sick. Individual 3 got sick because 2 got sick. 2 got sick because they got it from 5 earlier, and 5 got sick because they got it from 4 earlier. It's contact tracing of opinions instead of sicknesses. Okay, that was exhausting. Pause for a second. Hopefully that makes sense. Now let's do that for somebody else. And so if we do that for someone else, then we can say, all right, individual 4's opinion now was their opinion up until one time step ago. And then before that, maybe it was individual 2's opinion. So going on to 2. So there's 2's opinion down there. And then from there, it was individual 3's opinion. And then and then it's going to go across this gap. And then let's do that with another individual over here. So let's say individual 1. Individual 1, similarly, they say they had their opinion one time step ago. But before that, they got it from individual, I don't know, 4. And then that individual 4, let's say, got it from individual 3. So we get a collision. When this happens, we don't have to continue 2 traces. Okay? If you know that individual 1 and individual 4, whatever sickness, opinion, whatever you want to call it, whatever they have now, was the sickness or opinion of individual 3 had at time t minus 3. At that point, all we care about is where individual 3 got it. So now this trajectory is going to be a single trajectory that extends across this time gap that I've just drawn here to make room. So I'll do this dotted line here. Let's say that we're going to say individual 3 got their opinion actually from individual 1 at time 1. So we're aiming for this point here. So I'll just do the little break. And put this back to solid. We'll say that that trajectory is here, meaning that individual 3 at t minus 3 shares the opinion that individual 1 had at time 5. Individual 3 at t minus 3 is sick because individual 1 was sick at time 5. That's what we mean by contact tracing. And then if we then follow that back, we can follow it further. Let's say they were sick beforehand as well, and then that collides with this one here, and we get another collision. So I'm just going to circle these collisions in different colors here. Maybe I'll highlight them as well, just to emphasize how important these collisions are. And so what we're saying here is that after collisions, only follow one path to the right. So we've got 2 here become 1 there. Likewise, 2 here become 1 there. All right. And what does this tell us? If we do this with all of our individuals, all of them here, and all of these end up colliding and so-called coalescing. So we're going to call this here coalescing. We're going to try to call it coalescing. Feel like that's how to spell that. We're going to call this coalescing. And if everyone coalesces into 1 eventually, then we know we have consensus. So if you end up getting 1, if you do this with all 6 of these, you do it all over this here, and after all of that, you get a single tail coming out of here. You get this single 1 process, this 1 Markov chain on the right here. Then that means you've reached consensus, because that means that everyone's opinion now ultimately came from one person's opinion t minus a long time ago. That's what it means. That is a consensus condition. So that's what it means, that for everybody to have consensus means you all got the same opinion from an individual a lot far away. So moving this way, we see this individual's opinion splits into 2. Now these 2 people have it, and then eventually it splits, and now multiple people have it. These 3 people have it, and so on. If we can trace that, this way, and we find that everybody leads back to 1, that's our patient 0, our typhoid Mary, or whatever you want to call it. And then that means that, aha, we have consensus. If you trace things back and that never happens, so if you get these, let's say 2 individuals over here, 2 paths over here that never manage to ever intersect, and they just sort of constantly keep moving around each other, then that's a case where you don't have consensus. Okay, so let's formalize that a little bit more. So what we've just talked about are so-called coalescing random walks. So they're independent walkers from left to right until you get an intersection. And then after you intersect, the 2 walkers merge into 1. So they're 1 walker to the right, and there are 2 walkers. So 2 walkers to the left, 1 walker to the right. That's a coalescing random walk. Before they coalesce, they are independent random walks. So whether one moves up or down, it doesn't affect the probability that somebody else moves up or down. You can just view them as parallel walkers that ignore each other unless they happen to land on exactly the same opinion at exactly the same time. And or exactly the same person, exactly the same time. We're watching how the opinions walk across the sites, across the individuals. And if two opinions happen to coalesce in the same person at the same time, then we only follow one path from that on forward. So that's what we're saying here, coalescing random walks. Now, if we model consensus as all walkers eventually coalescing into one, kind of the Highlander model of consensus, there can be only one, then this means the opinion of one individual spread through the whole population. That's what I was kind of communicating before. And each walker is a simple Markov chain random walk with no absorbing states. Many, many mathematical tools are available for us to analyze this particular case. And we're going to focus on Pólya's recurrence theorem, which is focused on the accessibility of space to Markov chains given dimensionality. So let's look at that. Pólya's recurrence theorem. This is well-known results about Markov chains moving in spaces of different numbers of dimensions. So a random walkers, basically. So for dimension 1 or 2, so 1 or 2 dimensions, the result of the recurrence theorem is that a random walk will visit any point in this 1 or 2 dimensional space, including wherever they started, with probability 1, actually infinitely often. So they're just, you can guarantee that if there's a point in that line or that grid, and you start a walker, a random walker anywhere, they will eventually reach any point, every point in that grid, and they'll keep reaching it. So they'll eventually come back. They'll keep recurring there. So that is what we refer to as a recurrent Markov chain. It's a chain that it doesn't have absorbing states. It just keeps visiting the same sites over and over again. Every time it visits a site, it leaves a site, but then it will eventually come back to that site. And that means that two walkers will intersect with probability 1. So that's the other thing that means, is that you have two of these random walkers, the independent random walkers, in this space together. They will eventually collide. It's guaranteed. Pólya's recurrence theorem, guaranteed. That means that we will get unanimous consensus with probability 1 in 1 or 2 dimensions. So if you've got a voter model where the topologies are set up in a one-dimensional pattern or a two-dimensional pattern, so on a grid or a line, and you have this voter model, this random genetic drift happening, you will get fixation to one opinion. You will get unanimous consensus on one opinion. I can't tell you which opinion it'll be, but it will be one. You'll get fixation. That's kind of our drift to fixation case. That, I think, makes sense. If you've thought about genetic drift, I think that probably seems natural, that everything moves towards there. What is harder to see is this next point. Three dimensions or more. So now you're in a volume or higher. Pólya's recurrence theorem says now that random walker, there's a non-zero probability that a random walk will fail to ever reach certain points in the space. And it's not because there are no absorbing states. It just has so many degrees of freedom in how it moves that there is a non-zero probability that there are regions of space that the random walker will just never get into. If we think about a robot vacuum, this up here is going to tell you that a robot vacuum moving randomly around your floor will eventually cover your whole floor. It'll vacuum your whole floor. Now, let's say that you needed to vacuum in 3 dimensions. So you needed to scoop up particulate that was in the air or whatever, and you have a little drone that is flying around your house. If that drone is just moving around randomly, so it's not doing a lawnmower pattern or whatever, it's moving just randomly around that, there is a non-zero probability that there are regions of volumes in your house or your home or wherever you are that drone will just never ever touch. It just won't even fly through. It will just keep moving around. There's a, you could say it's like a 10% probability. You can do the geometry and actually see, but there's like a 10% probability that there's a football sized shape in the space that it just will never ever visit. That is such a cool result from this recurrence theorem. And and so we call that transient. So it is very much, it almost turns something, it's almost like an anti-absorbing state, it's like it won't ever get to these states. And so yeah, so it's this transient condition that we can't ever count on it ever reaching those states. It's as if we had an absorbing state and the Markov chain is just heading to the absorbing state. And there are states that are not on the path to the absorbing state, and they're just going to be left behind. So that's kind of what we mean by it's a transient condition. And so, that's bad for consensus. I mean, let's think about that. That means there's a non-zero probability that two walkers in space will never intersect. So if you have these two drones moving, if you have two robots, ground robots, moving around a floor, there is with 100% probability they will eventually bump into each other. On a line, for sure, 100% probability bump into each other, and on a grid too. In 3D, there is some non-zero probability they'll just keep missing each other. It's like two ships missing in the night, and they will never ever hit. That is what we're saying here. And what that means for our dual process is there's a non-zero probability that we will not reach unanimous consensus. There are a non-zero set of universes out there where genetic drift in three-dimensional topologies will not fixate on a single genotype. You'll just be stuck with, I don't want to say stuck, but you're just going to have this kind of you're just going to be you're going to have at least two opinions that are constantly going to be traded. It's almost like you're another way to view it is you're always going to have somebody getting sick with one of the other diseases or something like that. Maybe that's another way to view it. Point I'm trying to get to here is that neighborhood dimension matters to the overall global state of things. So that's pretty cool. What are the implications of this? In population genetics, neutral evolution in space might not fixate. Drift might not always purge diversity from populations like we would think it would in panmictic populations. Now, I don't want to get too excited about this because it's rare to think about cases where you'd get 3D spatial structuring. Normally, when we think about spatial structuring in population genetics, it's 2D. It's like island models. Like, there's some gene flow. You can hop from one island to another, but it's kind of lateral or whatever. It rarely would we map them into 3 dimensions. But there are some examples, like soil microbes with 3D pore structures in soil. You can then model that. You can imagine that, like, if suddenly a random event knocked out a bunch of microbes and other microbes had to fill in, and that kind of a drifty sort of change in the population structure, then that 3 dimensional structure in the soil, might be well modeled by this. Aquatic plankton. So you get stratified water columns in the open water of the ocean, the open ocean. That also, this could create these like 3D interaction areas. Microbial movement through 3D air columns. I mean, gravity tends to pull things down into a pancake, but there's still some vertical striation there of spores and viruses that might be turning over and changing their population structure. That could be happening in 3D. Cancer cells. Maybe this is a more interesting case. Cancer cells there's a bunch of neutral evolution that's going on. Cancer cells, and there's also a bunch of mutation going on. And they move through 3D extracellular matrices and tissues. And yeah, maybe that could apply it. There's one very, very speculative and kind of crazy idea: space travel, colonization of space. We are stuck on the surface of this planet, but once we start moving to other planets, you could then imagine. And once we think about gene flow, gene flow within the planet, within your plane, gene flow across. And then you could also imagine like these kind of 3D drift effects. And so this would sort of suggest that population genetics in 3D or more spatial structuring is not going to automatically fixate. You're not going to automatically get one genotype everywhere. You're going to constantly get this sort of bubbling mass of a bubbling brew of these kind of ever-changing genotypes in a dynamic equilibrium of fluctuating coexistence. So you're constantly have this like constant shifting mosaic where diversity or heterogeneity is never fully lost, but also never fully stable. That's what it's telling us. So if you think the voter model sounds like a good model for genetic drift, the voter model is telling us this. The dimensionality of that lattice on which the voters are embedded matters. Um, so that's kind of interesting, I think. At least shows us that spatial structure matters. What other types of interacting particle systems other than the voter model can help us answer complexity questions? Okay. All right, so this allows me to introduce cellular automaton, and then we'll close the lecture up after that. There's a type of interacting particle system called a CA, a cellular automata. Um, and in a CA, it's very similar to what we were just talking about the voter model. We've got cells. So those are our sites. They're just called cells in this case. And the state of our cells are determined by the states of the cells around that cell, neighborhood states. And the simplest kind of example of this is the 1D so-called elementary cellular automaton, or ECA. And Stephen Wolfram, the Mathematica guy, he wrote this book, A New Kind of Science, often called NKS, where he basically just goes hog wild on ECAs and the various different types of ECAs and what you can possibly learn about ECAs. So if you're interested in this stuff, then I encourage you to take a look at that book. Basic idea here is that an ECA is a line. So it's a one-dimensional structure here. And it has periodic boundaries. And so once you go over the edge here, then the neighbor of this cell is this cell. So it's basically, you take this and you repeat it here, and then likewise over, this way. So it acts like an infinite line, but it's just these periodic boundaries. So it's a line of cells. Each cell has a binary state. It could either be 0 or 1. There are other types of cellular automatons where you can have multiple states, where it can have continuous states. We're focusing on the simple binary states here. We then define updating rules. Those in an evolutionary cellular automata, the neighborhoods are simple. The neighborhoods are just three cells. They are the focal cell that you are considering an update in, its left neighbor, and its right neighbor. And you consider the state of all three. So your next state depends on the state of your neighbor, the state of yourself, and the state of your other neighbor. That is our, what we're saying here. So updating rule, you update the current state depending on your current state and your two adjacent states. So we often will draw that in this little Tetris T shape here. So this is saying here that if you take this little kernel, this little neighborhood kernel, you could take that and place it on top of this guy over here. And this is telling you that, okay, this is your left, this is your right, this is your current, and this is what the current will be replaced with. So these two relate to each other. So that's what we're depicting here. So these are the inputs, and this is the output. So let's see an example of that. So because each state can be 0 and 1, and because you and your neighbors are three cells, each that can be 0 and 1, then there's 8 possible input conditions. So there's 8 possible different ways that you can sort of transition to your next state. So what I mean by that is you can have neighbors who, well, you'll be a 1, your left neighbor's a 0, your right neighbor's a 1. You'll be a 1, your left neighbor's a 0, right neighbor's a 0. You'll be a 0, your left is 0, right is 0. You'll be a 0 while your left is 0 and your right is 0. These are 4 cases. And what we're saying is that for these 4 cases, then you take on these values down here. And these values down here for this particular updating rule are just a copy of your current values. So what this is basically saying is that if your left neighbor is 0, then just copy your current value straight down. And so these four outputs, if we know that these input conditions are ordered this way, so this is binary for 0, this is binary for 1, this is binary for 2, this is binary for 3. I guess I could write that in. So you could call this, this is the 0 case, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3 in binary. So if we order them that way, then all we need to do is report the bits. And so these bottom 4 bits are 0, 0, 1, 1, which in binary, that's equal to 12. In hexadecimal, it's equal to C. So if somebody asks me, what are your bottom 4 bits? I can just say 12, or I can just say C. And so that bottom 4 bits is referred to as a nibble. So we can say the bottom nibble, the least significant nibble of this rule is 12, or is C in hex. That's one way to view that. So then what's the upper nibble? Okay, the upper nibble for this particular rule, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. Well, if I were to write that out, this is binary for 4, binary for 5, binary for 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, of course, binary for 7. I think for a second there, I was worried that I wasn't going to get up to 8, and then I realized, wait, it's 0 indexed. So 0 through 7. So we just ordered things this way, and in this upper nibble, this is saying under these conditions, these are the outputs. And so for this upper nibble, it's not quite as simple what the condition is. So basically, when your left neighbor is a 1, then your output depends on you and your right neighbor. So this is saying you only output a 1. If your left neighbor is a 1, you only output a 1 if you are a 0 and your right neighbor is a 1. Otherwise, you output a 0 in that case. That's how this rule is here. And so that rule, this upper nibble, is the binary for 2. And so, which is also 2 in hex. And so if I think of this as a hexadecimal number, then this is 2 times 16 plus 12. Or if I converted this 8-bit string to decimal, then I get 44. And that's why this is known as Rule 44. The 44 is just the decimal encoding of this 8-bit string. So computer scientists, for whatever reason, and maybe physicists too, I guess, because Wolfram's kind of a physicist, a little bit of a mathematician. They like to do these rules in decimal. Those of us with an electrical engineering background don't understand this at all, because when you look at 44, you can't see the bit string automatically unless you've memorized, all 256 bit patterns. That's why when I write the rules, I like to write them in hex, because that shows me the 2 nibbles, and I can remember easily the 16 patterns for all of the possible digits here from 0 through S. I know, from 000 to 1111, I know all those patterns, how they go from 0 through F, 0 through 9, and then A through F. And so if I know those, then I can look at this and I can say, okay, C, that's 1100. And so that's the condition when the left bit is 0, and 2, that's 0010. That's the rule when the left bit is 1. And it's just easier for me to unpack these in my head. But for whatever reason, the people that are really into ECAs really like decimal, so they call this Rule 44, and then you have to actually write it all out. So it's a little ugly, but that's how we write ECA rules, and that gives us the rules for these updatings. All right, so let's look at that. This is basically summarizing what I just said about Rule 44. You can conceptualize that as saying when the left neighbor is 0, you just keep your state. When the left neighbor is 1, you output a 1 only when the right neighbor is 0, the right neighbor is 1 and you are 0. That's Rule 44. Let's try a different one, Rule 184. This is known as the traffic rule. So it's 184, and it is, for those keeping score, it's the upper nibble is B, the lower nibble is 8. B is 11. 11 times 16 plus 8 gives us the 184. So here is the 11. Here is the 8, for those who liked that. The reason it's called the traffic rule, and I've kind of hinted at it with these little arrows, is it's simulating left to right traffic, where 1 represents an occupied space where there's a vehicle, and 0 is an empty space where there's not. So at every time step, if a vehicle is next to an empty space, then you move the vehicle over and you put an empty in its spot. So that's what I think I'm saying down here. So in this case here, you imagine 1 gets moved over to 1, gets replaced with the 0, which means you output a 0. Whereas in this one, 1 moves into the middle spot and gets replaced with 0. But because you focus on the middle spot, that's why you get a 1 on the output here. So if you simulate rule 184, you get traffic patterns moving from left to right. Okay, so there are a bunch of other interesting rules. I'm going to highlight one, and then I'm not going to talk much more about the rest of these. But rule 110 is one that comes up a lot in this literature because it's Turing complete. Seems a little crazy, but if you have a wide enough initial condition, a wide enough uh, number of cells in the top, you can use a special type of programming to program that initial set with a program that, as long as that program terminates, then what's going to happen is that this rule, rule 110, or if you like the hex framework, 6E, that rule will end up unrolling and eventually will come to a stopping point that, so it'll sort of come to a constant state where you can decode that state as the output of the program. So you could write a program that, say, adds up all numbers from 1 to 100. You could encode that in a special way, and you can look up how to do this, for that initial condition. It might be a very, very, very wide CA, and then you can let the CA run, and eventually it will converge to a set of cells which represent the sum of all numbers from 1 to 100, and you can figure out how to read that out. So that's kind of cool that you can actually use CAs. So this is suggesting that computation really can be implemented in a distributed way using entirely local interactions. There are other rules as well that are much simpler than that, like these two rules, Rule 204, Rule 51, Rule CC or 33. One of them is the identity. It just copies whatever the next is going to equal to the previous. There's also Rule 51, which toggles. Whatever the previous state is, it gets toggled to the next one. There's a left and also a right shift. And so that's just going to take whatever was in the right neighbor and it's going to put it in the current one. And so that will cause things to shift in a particular way. It's sort of similar to the traffic rule, but the traffic rule, you actually get cars kind of moving relative to each other, whereas the left shift, you get to kind of shifting. If you like pattern generation, then rule 90, if you give a single bit input at the top, so everything's 0 and then 1 bit, it'll generate a Sierpinski triangle. So that's the one that's the fractal, where you get a big triangle with a bunch of little triangles inside it that have a bunch of little triangles, and so on, where there's a lot of self-similarity. So every triangle looks like the bigger triangle it came from. And then similar to that, rule 30 is a chaos generator. So you can give it a single bit on the top, and then it will give you these patterns that don't look like they have any kind of relationship to patterns before them. So they're totally deterministic because there's no noise in here, but they're not predictable, not obviously predictable. So you can turn this into a nice pseudo-random number generator. For example, you could count the number of ones in every row, and that might be like, oh, there's 52 ones in this row, and the next row there's 2, and the next row there's 170, and the next row there's 142. So that could become a pseudo-random number generator. And if you want to try these out, and so I know I'm at about 74 minutes, so I don't have much more to talk about here, but I do want to cover one more slide, and then I'm going to show you NetLogo at the end of this, where we can see what some of these rules look like and how you could try them out. But I want to make sure I cover all of the content that you might see, let's say, in the concept check without running too much over here. So you definitely can try these out. And here's kind of the instructions for how to do that. And I'll show you that at the end of this lecture. But the last connections I wanted to make, and then we'll be done with the kind of regulation context here, is that these neural networks can also be, or sorry, these CAs can also be viewed as models for neural networks, because neural models or computations can be expressed as CAs. So you have a focal element, a neuron, which is influenced by its neighbor states. The activation function of one neuron is completely dependent upon the state of the neurons connected to its input. Those are its neighbors. So the inputs are its neighbors. And in the case of recurrent neural networks, the previous output of the current neuron is an input. So that's just like an evolutionary cellular automaton. So we can effectively simulate neural networks in CAs. And in tools like NetLogo that I mentioned, they actually have neural network models built inside NetLogo that you can learn about neural networks that are implemented as cellular automatons or as agent-based models. The last one, and this last one I wanted to make sure that I got to, coming back to the very beginning of the class, you can also use CAs to better think about spatial structure in evolution and then build new evolutionary algorithms that maybe maintain diversity better, which allows for a better exploration through space as you're looking for strategies. And I'm not going to talk much at all about this. In fact, just this much. That's all I'm going to talk about this. But this is the so-called Cellular Evolutionary Algorithm, or CEA. And this is basically an evolutionary algorithm where parents and offspring are determined by CA-like rules. So who do the parents get a chance to potentially recombine with? Those are, you can say, well, this parent gets access to these parents next to it. That's the gene pool for recombination for the offspring immediately under the next parent. So you spatially structure your pool so that you've got these three parents all compete to give genes to the next single offspring beneath this parent up here. And so you just take all of the GA rules, but whenever you do things that require assembling a pool of individuals to draw from or to select from, to apply a selection operator on, to do crossover, all that sort of stuff. You do that in these local little kernels, these local little neighborhood kernels, and then you do that across each, and that's how you get your next offspring. So it provides spatial structure to population genetics, and that spatial structure potentially allows for different ways to manage diversity, which might be important, especially for things like multi-objective optimization, multimodal optimization. All right, that was the big key point. So just I'm going to give these takeaways, and then I'm going to cut to a NetLogo example. So the rest of this is just all basically summary and and a little bit of extra icing on the top. But for those of you that are sick of this and are done, you can stop this now. But the basic takeaways, starting from the top, is that CAs and interacting particle systems model a broad range of spatially structured phenomena. Like I've mentioned, we talk about, it's spanning from neural network populations, like in the very first unit of this class, all the way to neural networks, like in the most recent unit of this class. So that's cool. So they're a really cool tool for understanding computation as an emergent phenomenon, which allows us to think about new ways to use simple components in complex designs. And so we don't have to load a lot of complexity or complicated structures into individual units. We can have cheap units, but lots of them with interesting, relatively simple interactions that we can verify that those interactions work, and then scale up. And then when we think about a lot of them together, then we get behaviors that were not quite as predictable if we thought about each individual unit in a vacuum. But then together, they do so much more. That's what we mean by emergence. And if we can figure out ways in which to understand emergence, we can come up with totally new ways to design things. That's the basic idea. And with that, I'm going to do the NetLogo model, but I do just want to mention that that's basically all of the new content here. Just as a reminder, your projects are due Wednesday, tomorrow. If you're watching this on Tuesday night, the peer reviews are due Saturday. Good luck with your finals, including this one. Again, the final exam, there's practice final exams online, basically just going to be a sampling. It's very going to be like the concept checks. And I hope you have a nice summer. But I want to make sure that I at least show you the NetLogo in case you're interested in playing with the CAs. So thanks for coming this far. So I'm going to stop sharing this guy and then share instead. Um, and then share instead this NetLogo example. So what I've done is I've opened up NetLogo 6.40. It looks pretty bland, nothing that special. But if I go up to File and NetLogo here, and I go to my models library, then it opens up this interesting uh, set of pre-built examples that just come bundled with NetLogo, which make for a lot of great ways to learn this agent-based modeling tool. But that's not really my major focus here. I am going to go under the computer science group here, and then they've got a whole group of cellular automata, and then a lot of cool stuff to investigate. I am going to open up the 1D CA here, CA 1D elementary, open that up. And I'll zoom in on this a little bit to make that a little nicer to see in the video, I hope. So over here in this 1DCA, the way this works is you set up well, I guess let me just run it once so we can see what output looks like. So I'm going to hit set up single here, and that sets up the initial conditions. Now, it might be hard to see, but there's like a single green dot right here. I could have also done set up random. And then now you can see there's a bunch of green dots, but they're all along the top here. That is our initial condition. That is our initial cellular population, where the black ones are zeros, the green ones are ones. So you're just setting up that initial population. I can then hit go, and it's going to run rule. Now, this rule is rule 105. And if you look here, they allow you can either scroll through the rules here, or you can manually change the rules. So you can see like this says 111 off, 101 on. So this is basically defining those little triangles. It's got this little show rules. I can click here and notice the show rules here. This is saying this is what you've configured. And that gives you the little Tetra-shaped figures that I was talking about before, where you can see here 111, that's over here, goes to a 0, 000 goes to a 1. So look down here, 000 is on, 111 is off. This here 100 goes to a 0. So if I look over here, they've got 100 is off, which means I go to a 0. So they've organized this in the opposite order as I usually do. So they put 111 on the right and 000 on the left. But that's it. So that was the show rules here. So I'm going to go and hit set up single again. So I've got the single point with this rule. If I hit go, what it's going to do, and notice it's got a little loop signal here. What this go does is it runs the CA rules over and over and over again. So it runs out on the first row to produce the second row to produce the third row, and so on. So when I do that, I get this. So I get this cool Sierpinski-like triangle shape here, this rule 105. I mentioned some of the other rules. So I said that, for example, rule 90, I said generates a Sierpinski triangle. So theoretically, I can drag this over to 90. 85, 6, 7, 8, 9, 90, rule 90 right there. And if I hit set up single, notice it then updated these switches, and it's going to do a single there. If I hit go, then I get the Sierpinski triangle. So that's fun. If I select auto continue, then it will take the last row and then make it the top row and then just keep going. So if I were to do that, then it keeps going with that. So, and then it'll reset and it keeps yada yada going on like that. All right, so that's the Sierpinski triangle, not that exciting. I mentioned that rule 30 is a chaos generator. So if I drag this to rule 30 and I do say setup single, if I hit go, then I get these funny little patterns where, and I guess I could turn off, maybe I'll turn off the auto continue right now. If I just look at this pattern right here, then I hope you see that like these empty triangles, like their position, it's not obvious. There's no pattern. It's not like the Sierpinski triangle, and they're chaotic. And so if you were to go across these rows and count the number of green spots in every row, you would effectively get a random number generator. There might be a little bit of autocorrelation initially when I did that setup single, because it starts out and these things are just not very dense up top here. So there you get a violation of independence, and so you get significant autocorrelation. But once things have filled out the whole space, then it becomes a halfway decent pseudo-random number generator. Simpler ones like left shift. So if I do 170 here, so 170. If I do setup single, it's going to look pretty boring. It just took that single point and it shifted it to the left. And if I were to do continuous, it'd just keep wrapping around this world. If I do setup random and then do go, then it takes that barcode that it had at the top and just shifts it to the left. I mentioned the traffic rule. So the traffic rule is rule 184. So I'm going to do rule 184. And so if I do that, and I'm going to do maybe say, well, if I do set up single with the traffic rule, it's boring. It looks like a shift right, but that's not what the traffic rule is doing. So I'm going to do set up random. And then now if I hit go, then if you look here, you notice that it eventually it's just a shifting to the right. But there is this transient condition right up here where these cars were ended up kind of finding their right spot. So I could try that again, set up random, hit go. That one's not that exciting. Set up random, set up random. So I'm just keep getting a bunch of, let me do a higher density, and I think I'll get more traffic jams. Yeah, so you see here, notice now everybody, it looks like things are going to the left. So I've reached congestion. So I had this initial transient die-off. It's like just enough space for cars to reposition themselves into the void. That's what's happening here. So basically, we started out with a big gap, and then these cars moved forward into the gap, but these cars were stuck. And so the cars move forward into the gap, but then they just move forward just because get stuck themselves. And what we're seeing here is a backward moving wave of the traffic jam. So I've increased the density to the point where I'm above capacity on this transportation channel. And so you get backward moving congestion instead of forward moving traffic. So that's kind of cool. If I shift the density the other way and hit go, then I get the forward moving traffic, but there's your transients right there. So, there are things that we can play with this, that's long transients. So now that I'm close to that critical density that reaches the capacity of this simulated transportation system, then I get the combination of backward moving waves and forward moving waves, and they're sort of duking it out. And so cars keep having to position themselves. It's like they're phantom traffic jams. You get cars speeding up and then slowing down and then speeding up and slowing down, and that's what's being simulated here. So a lot of cool stuff that you can do with that. Now that's in terms of modeling, but what's kind of neat about that is that I can combine rules to do computation. And this is the last example that I want to kind of end with, is that you can get things like a density, a density classifier. So let's say I wanted to um, set up, I'm going to set up random. I have an initial group, like I have no idea what, here I set the density, but let's just say from my initial, I want to figure out, are there more ones or more zeros in this particular row? How would I build a density classifier that would look at that and then make an inference and say, that's majority ones or majority zeros? Now, it turns out that the traffic rule combined with the majority rule ends up being a density classifier. So there is another rule, Rule 232, which is called the majority rule. And so I'm not going to go into all of those details here, but I just want to show the basic idea so that I now have this. I'm going to make it like a 40 or 38% density. I'm going to set up random. I'm going to run my traffic rule for a while to where my traffic rule looks like it reaches its equilibrium behavior, which looks like it's about here. At this point, I'm now going to flip this to Rule 232, the so-called majority rule, which what it means by majority rule is basically it's going to look at the bits like maybe I should do this. So I'm going to do show rules, and this is the majority rule. So notice here that the time when it's a 1 on the output is when there are 2 or more ones on the input. The time when it's a 0 on the output is when there are fewer than 2 ones. So all zeros give me a 0, 2 zeros give me a 0, 2 zeros give me a 0, 2 zeros give me a 0. Otherwise, I get a 1. That's why it's called the majority rule. It takes the majority in your group of 3 inputs. It takes the majority position, the majority opinion, or whatever you want to call it, and that's what it takes on the output. I can start with 184, the traffic rule. So I'm going to do setup random at this density 38%. I'm going to let this go until it hits some equilibrium, and then I'm going to shift to 232. Okay. I'm going to keep running. And let's see what happens with 232. So I had to let that finish in order for it to update the rule internally. And once it got to the very bottom, then it flipped from rule 184 to rule 232, and it started applying 232. And look, everything's black. That's not a coincidence. And I'll do another example to prove this to you. When you run 184 to equilibrium, and then you run 232, 232 will converge on either all black if you started out with greater than 50% density, or all white if you started out with less than 50% density. So the combination of those two rules, 184 and 232, is a density classifier. It's an example of doing computation in space using these simple rules. So let me increase the density now to like, 69%, set up random. Sorry, I want to do 184 first. 184, let that go. I'll just let it go all the way to, I'm going to let it go till there, and we'll do the same thing. Now we're going to go to 232. Okay. Now I'm going to hit go. It's going to be 184 until it hits the bottom. It's going to regenerate up top. If I do continuous, and then it's all black, all green, all ones. So, and it'll stay all ones like that. So that's the idea here is that, and you can prove that this is the case. You can prove that this will happen every time. And so the idea here is that 184 spaces things out so that based on density, like once things are properly spaced out, if you're less than 50%, then what the traffic rule is, it's going to put enough gap between every car that when the majority rule applies, then it's going to eventually lead to all blacks because the majority sort of position is going to be black. But then if you're greater than 50%, then you're not going to be able to space things out that much in the traffic rule. So when the majority rule applies, there's just going to be ones everywhere, and then it's going to then converge to all ones. So that's the idea, is that by combining these two rules, you can do that particular computation against you. And it is a calculation. It is a computation. It is an inference. You can train a neural network to say, look at this bitmap. Is this bitmap majority ones or majority zeros? That's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And this does it. And so this just shows that you can have kind of these spatial rules, these local rules, and those local rules will end up leading you to these computation, doing these computations. And Rule 110 allows you to kind of program, but that sort of is how to build a computer, a general purpose computer with the CAs. This is actually showing that the CAs, in an embodied way, can do a computation in physical space using physical space as the environment. Rule 110 is somehow not as exciting because the physical space is just a substrate for tape. It's a substrate for program. Whereas these other ways you combine rules, you're actually making inferences about the world in which they are embedded. And that's pretty cool. That feels very natural. That feels like, an ant colony deciding whether they need more carbohydrates or more protein the next time they go out on foraging. They need sort of a nutrient classifier that they can sort of gather information in a decentralized distributed way in order for the foragers to then converge on that option. And notice the foragers have to converge in that decentralized way. They can't just ask, hey, nutrient manager, what's the nutrient that I need to go out for? They don't even converse with each other necessarily. They just look at the rest of the colony to decide on that. All right. I've kept things over a little too much, but I wanted to make sure I gave you enough to think about for this unit. For those of you who might be interested in this, there's a lot more that could be said about this. And it would be, there's a whole class you could build just based on these. And so if you're interested in this, check out NKS, New Kind of Science. Check out some of the resources that I put in the Unit 8. Maybe try doing a simple, implementation of a CA or a stochastic CA or an evolutionary CA, and put that together as a mini project. Just do in a couple of days, unfortunately. Um, and play with it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. Otherwise, have a nice summer. If I don't talk to you, good luck on finals. Don't forget about your final projects and your, so both the report and the presentation. Don't forget about the peer reviews, and have a good week.